So we have some massive news coming out here. The Las Vegas Raiders are apparently rolling forward into this next matchup with Caleb Rogers as their starting guard. And this is not something that we expected. Kind of coming into this week, both Dylan Parham and Jackson Powers-Johnson went down in this most recent game against the Denver Broncos. And of course, JPJ, the report right now is it's a long-term injury. But with Dylan Parham, we don't really know. There's really not been any update. But some people have speculated he has a high ankle sprain, which could mean that there's two potential spots open for the Raiders. And apparently Caleb Rogers is going to be one of the guys that's going to get that opportunity. At least that's what the early reports are. Now, it's not 100% confirmed if he'll be the starter, but it does seem like, based off of some of what Caleb Rogers has said himself in some of these pressers, he will be the Raiders starting guard. Now, this is a week where, if you're a rookie and it's your very first time playing in the NFL, this is not the game you want to start in, right? Obviously, you got Quinnen Williams, Oso Digizua, and then, of course, the Cowboys also traded for Kenny Clark in that Micah Parsons trade. That's three really good interior defensive linemen. This is going to be a very, very difficult matchup, but apparently Caleb Rogers is ready for it, man, and I'm excited to see what the rookie has as we kind of get into it. I'm going to be honest, guys, I didn't think he looked all that good in preseason. When you watch a guy like Jackson Powers-Johnson, for example, even back I don't think he played in preseason, but I think, like week 2 or 3 when he first kind of came in for the Raiders, you just saw the explosiveness. You saw the ability to move people at the point of attack. You saw a guy that, he was literally dominant out there, right? You saw that with JPJ right away. With Caleb Rogers, I don't see a guy that's dominant. And that doesn't mean he can't be a good football player still, right? It doesn't mean he can't be a really good interior offensive lineman for the Raiders. But I did not really see that in his preseason tape. Keep in mind, oftentimes in preseason, you're playing backup players. So if you're a second or third round pick, you'd expect that guy to come in and be good, especially early on in preseason. And he hasn't really been able to do that in preseason. But again, some guys develop a little bit differently. So hopefully Caleb Rogers, as he gets out there, shows us, that he could be a long-term starter for the Raiders. And I'm excited, man. I'm excited to watch this guy. There's not a whole lot to be excited about for the Raiders at this point. But I think watching some of the younger guys is something you can actually look forward to. Caleb Rogers is one of the guys that I really want to watch. Of course, Charles Grant is another guy that I'm excited to watch. Grant, I don't think is going to end up starting for the Raiders at all this season. I'd be really, really surprised. But you never know, one injury away from a guy potentially having to step in. So we'll see what ends up happening as the Raiders kind of go forward. Just kind of talking about Caleb Rogers potentially starting. We did get an update today. So Jackson Powers-Johnson was actually placed on injured reserve. So this was official, right? Officially, Jackson Powers-Johnson was put on injured reserve. JPJ also, he did post on social media. Pete Carroll talked a little bit about him yesterday as well. And we know for a fact JPJ, he's probably done for the season, but he will, he'll be healthy as we get into next season. And, if this was week 1 of the season, JPJ would have been back, week 7 or 8, and he would have been good to go. So this isn't something that'll keep him out long term. And I also don't expect the ankle injury that he has, I don't expect it to carry into next season or the season after that. I think this is just a one-time injury, kind of bad luck. JPJ has officially been placed on injured reserve. See if Caleb Rogers can step in and start. The Raiders also did sign another player. So the Raiders signed linebacker Jamin Davis to the active roster from their practice squad. And I guess this isn't a new guy that they've signed, but they're bringing Jamin Davis up from the practice squad to the active roster. Now, we've talked about Jamin Davis in the past. If you guys remember, the Raiders only signed him 2 or 3 weeks ago. We talked about Jamin Davis and the potential and the upside that this guy had. Jamin Davis is essentially a former first-round pick. He's 6'3.5", and he's super, super, super athletic. He's a really good fit for the Pete Carroll scheme and system. And we're actually going to get to see him play now for the Raiders. I'm not a fan of Landon Roberts. I think he's kind of bad in coverage. And I think the Raiders defense has kind of been taken advantage of with some of their linebackers. And I don't think Devin White's that bad, to be honest. I think he's a lot better than Landon Roberts in coverage. And Roberts isn't terrible as a run defender, but I think run defenders are a little overrated. And now the Raiders are potentially making a shift and saying, hey, we might want to put Jamin Davis in. We might want to see what Jamin Davis can do. Also, I just want to kind of throw this out there as we're talking about that new guys kind of playing. Charles Snowden's played a lot the past 2 weeks, and on tape, he's looked really good. So shout out to Charles Snowden from just continuing to develop, continuing to play. I think he came over to the Raiders like, it wasn't last season, but I think the season before that. And he looked pretty good, and he played a lot for the Raiders last year. He looks pretty good, and he's young too. Truth be told, I think Charles Snowden has shown us more upside than Tyree Wilson has up to this point. So shout out to Snowden for looking good. Jamin Davis might end up playing for the Raiders, at some point in this next game against the Cowboys. And of course, you guys probably saw it in that last tweet, but Raiders also signed kicker Greg Joseph to the practice squad. This one's interesting, man, because look, I'm not the first one that feels like this, and I'm definitely not the last one, but Daniel Carlson has cost the Raiders games this season and even last season. Right, there was a moment last year where I talked about the Raiders potentially having to, find a replacement for Daniel Carlson. And then I think at that time, a lot of Raider fans were not ready to actually have that conversation about replacing him because he was a pretty good kicker. 3 or 4 years ago when he first came over to the Raiders, he was solid. Right, he was clutch. He was making all those kicks that the Raiders needed him to make. But over the last, this season and last season, he's kind of fallen off and he just hasn't looked as good. He has missed field goals consistently. Like extra points, he'll have field goals that he'll miss. In today's NFL, if your kicker can't make every single kick that's like 55 yards and less, you got to replace that guy. Right? If you guys don't know, the NFL made a rule change which has allowed kickers to essentially use their own footballs. So kickers can break in balls, right? And instead of it being a brand new ball that's hard, that isn't broken in, it doesn't fly as well through the air, right? Because it's a brand new football. The NFL has now said as a kicker, you can bring your own ball to the game and you can kick with that ball. So now we're seeing guys kick 60, 70, not 70, but like 65, 66, 67, 68-yard field goals. So we're seeing that a lot more this season. That's because of the rule change. So now we're at the point, if you can't as a kicker bring your own ball and consistently hit 55-yard field goals, and I know it's hard, football, or the kicking position, oftentimes it's really from a mental aspect. You miss one field goal, you might miss the next 7, right? And I think Daniel Carlson's kind of getting to that point where he's feeling that pressure almost. So, let's see what the Raiders can do with a guy like Greg Joseph. Maybe he comes in, he pushes Carlson a little bit more, and maybe Carlson will bounce back. I think that's the best case scenario. But if he doesn't, if he continues to miss kicks, put Greg Joseph in. Let's see what this guy has. If he doesn't work out, just keep turning it over. There's 1,000 kickers out there. You can find guys in the UFL that will end up being a lot better than guys in the NFL right now. It's a hard position for the opportunity to come, but there are guys out there. So we'll see what ends up happening. Some people have said the Raiders should potentially bring in Justin Tucker. I disagree with this 100%. Justin Tucker's suspension has officially ended. He's free to play for any NFL team moving forward. If you guys don't know, obviously he had a bunch of allegations against him, and he was suspended for 10 games. And the NFL had obviously found that the allegations were true. I think at this point for the Raiders, this doesn't make sense. And I only bring this up because I've seen 3 big Raiders accounts. And this was before Greg Joseph officially had signed with the Raiders earlier today. But I had seen 2 or 3 big Raiders accounts say that the Raiders should bring in Justin Tucker. He's a great kicker, but I just think that at this point, you don't want more distractions if you're the Raiders. You sign this guy, there's going to be 1,000 stories out there talking about how the Raiders bring in, Justin Tucker. So I would not if I'm the Raiders. I think you can find other kickers that are just as good, if not better. Let's wrap it up, man. There's a couple more updates I want to get into. I also want to look at some of the quarterbacks, which we'll look at here in a second, that are coming out of college. But Ian Rappaport said that the Cowboys have activated linebacker DeMarvion Overshown from the physically unable to perform list. And then they also activated Siobhan Revel from the NFI, the non-football injury-related list. So these 2 guys may return for the Raiders, or against the Raiders coming up on Monday Night Football. DeMarvion Overshown, I believe he was a 2nd-round pick when he came out a couple years ago. Overshown's a very, very, very talented linebacker. I think he's one of the best talents in the entire NFL. Unfortunately for him, he's had a couple ACL injuries. He's had a couple other injuries just over the course of his career. He's just never been able to stay healthy. But at some point, if Overshown does stay healthy, he's going to be a really good young linebacker. He'll be very productive, and he has a chance to return against the Raiders. Now, he might not return because it was just activated, so there's a chance he doesn't play in this game. Same with Siobhan Revel. Siobhan Revel, if you guys remember, he came out last year. Some people are saying he was a top 5 by potential pick. Like, he had that type of upside. But he was also hurt, so he also ended up falling a little bit. And the Cowboys ended up getting Revel, I believe, in the second round. He has a ton of upside, and he's played a little bit in the NFL as well, but there's a chance both these guys are back against the Raiders. That just kind of favors the Cowboys a little bit more. I'm going to be honest, I don't think the Raiders are going to beat the Cowboys. I think that the Raiders, we have our issues, and even if our offense clicks, I mean, the Cowboys are a high efficient offense, and they're going to put up, 30, 40 points on the Raiders. In my opinion, I think they're going to end up doing it. Dak Prescott, George Pickens, CD Lamb, and then more than that, that offensive line's really, really good. If you're a Raiders fan and you don't know what a good offensive line looks like, you're going to see against the Cowboys. Just pay attention to that unit right there. Again, I have very little confidence in the Raiders at this point. Maybe they'll put it together and start winning some games, but I think the Raiders also are going to have to figure out how they're going to handle the quarterback position as they kind of go forward. Now, I've already told you guys this. The Raiders are not drafting a quarterback, and I'm pretty confident in that, right? The guy that's told me that specifically is a very smart guy, has a lot of connections. I don't think the Raiders can draft a quarterback, to be honest with you guys, but the Raiders could end up with like a pick as high as right now as a second overall pick. So right now, I think we have the 6th or 7th overall pick. Plenty of games left. Some of those 1 and 2 win teams will play one another. Right now, the only 1-win team is the Tennessee Titans, and the Titans obviously drafted Cam Ward last year. So there's a chance if they have the number 1 overall pick, they're not going with the quarterback. So if the Raiders end up with the number 2 overall pick and the Titans don't draft the quarterback, that means the Raiders could potentially get the best quarterback coming out, or at least who they think. And here's the interesting thing with this year's class. It's pretty stacked. I'm not going to lie to you guys. Now, I don't agree with the current list that's out there right now, right? This is the consensus big board. So you take every single mock draft that's coming out, every draft by PFF, every draft by The Athletic, every draft by CBS. This is just the consensus of that, right? Most drafts right now have Fernando Mendoza as the number 1 quarterback, Ty Simpson, Dante Moore, Lenoria Sellers is still super high. Garrett Nussmeier's right there, Drew Aller's down here, Carson Beck, just some of the higher known quarterbacks. Here's the thing with this class, man. There's so many quarterbacks, and we don't really know which guys are going to end up going in the top 10 and which guys are going to slip a little bit. But I think if there's ever been a year in which we're going to get a bunch of quarterbacks in the top 50 picks, I think this is the year. I think there's a real chance that if, let's just say, let's say Fernando Mendoza goes 2nd overall to Team X. I think there's a chance that when pick 15 comes around, and if it's the Los Angeles Rams, I think there's a chance they take a quarterback. They might take Garrett Nussmeier. They might take Drew Aller. Right? I think this is the year, if you're a team with the quarterback, you might still end up just drafting one, and maybe it's in the 2nd round. For the Raiders, I'm going to be honest, I think we do need to get a quarterback, but I would also not be mad if the Raiders skipped out on a quarterback, right? So let's say you have the 5th overall pick, and whoever the number 1 consensus quarterback ends up being, if it is Mendoza, and let's say he's the first quarterback that's off the board, and now pick 5 comes around, you look at some of the talent that's out there. Ruben Bain looks really good on tape. Arvell Reese, some people saying he's the next, Michael Parsons type of player. He looks really good as well on tape. I think he's a defensive end, not a linebacker. And then you can get into some of the playmakers. Jordan Tyson could easily be that next, Jamar Chase caliber of wide receiver. There's just so many good players. Spencer Fano, I think he's an elite tackle. I don't know why he's being ranked as low as he is, right? I don't know how we're getting safeties. And I like Caleb Downs, but I don't know how we're getting safeties going ahead of Spencer Fano. That doesn't make sense to me. But there's just so many talented players. And I would be surprised if the Raiders say, hey, let's take QB3, for example, over a guy like Arvell Reese, over a guy like Jordan Tyson, over a guy like Spencer Fano. I would be surprised if the Raiders said, that's what we're going to do. And again, I know a guy, the guy that I know is legit, right? And I'm not just putting this out there to put this out there. People tell me things all the time, and I don't just throw things out there to throw them out there, right? I'm pretty confident the Raiders aren't taking a quarterback. which means they could easily upgrade their wide receiver position. They could easily upgrade the right tackle position. Although I'm not 100% sold that the Raiders need to get a right tackle. I believe in Charles Grant, to be honest with you guys. But maybe it's wide receiver or edge, interior defensive line. I don't know. I'm not 100% sold on the quarterback class. I'm not that. I don't know if the Raiders are 100% sold that they need a quarterback, right? And, there are guys like Lenorius Sellers, who I'm not really that big of a fan of, to be honest. Kind of reminds me of Anthony Richardson, and he might be a little bit better than Richardson. I would much rather have a quarterback that can throw the football. Give me Garrett Nussmeier, give me Drew Aller. I like those two quarterbacks in terms of being able to throw the football. And I know Nussmeier is struggling this season, but I think LSU's team is not as good this year relative to past years. So I think it's a bad year for him. I think he should have came out last year. I think he would have potentially been a top 10 pick. Same with Drew Aller, although Penn State had a phenomenal team coming into this season. They just weren't able to make it work. They obviously ended up firing their coach, and Aller got hurt as well, right? So again, if I'm the Raiders, if Garrett Nussmeier or Drew Aller are there in the second round, I think it's important that we talk about this. I'm going to wrap this up. I don't want to keep dragging this on, but I think it's important for us to realize, the best quarterbacks in the NFL right now are the guys that are having the most success. A lot of them weren't great early on in their careers, but they got better and they developed, and at some point they became good quarterbacks. Sam Darnold, Daniel Jones, Baker Mayfield, those are good quarterbacks right now in the NFL, and they're only going to continue to get better, right? In 5 years, I think Sam Darnold is going to be really, really, really good. And he's already good, but I think he'll be even better in 5 years from now. And there's quarterbacks that are being written off right now. Bryce Young may get traded or released in 2 years. But I think in 5 years from now, Bryce Young will also bounce back and he'll be a good quarterback. And I say that because, Lenorius Sellers, for example, just as an example, how far away is he right now when, he might bust out or he might not be a good quarterback for the first 5 years of his NFL career. And maybe he'll be good in 8 years from now. But I almost feel like for the Raiders, would it be smarter to say, hey, we're going to take a quarterback that's played 5 years in college because he has 5 years of experience, like Drew Aller, for example, right? I think he's played 5 years in college. And that's an experienced quarterback. He's going to come into the NFL. Yeah, he'll have his 2 years of struggles, but will he be better sooner than a guy that's maybe raw, that's only spent 3 years in college? Ty Simpson, right? I think he's only played 3 years. I think he's technically a sophomore right now, so how far away is Simpson? And then Simpson's looked good this season, right? He has Alabama kind of rolling right now. Dante Moore, another guy. Moore's looked really good as well, but he doesn't have a lot of experience playing football, right? At least at the highest level. College right now, NFL eventually. I don't know. I think for the Raiders, I'm confident based off my source that they're not taking a quarterback. So I would easily take the best wide receiver. I would easily take the best offensive lineman. I would take the best defensive lineman as well, right? Especially if you have a top 10 pick. And then you can come back in the second round and say, hey, let's take a quarterback that can start in 3 years from now. Let's get a guy that can develop, right? We've seen how some quarterbacks have been able to kind of get into a scheme and system and then develop and eventually take over. Lamar Jackson was drafted as a backup, eventually took over. Jalen Hurts was drafted as a backup, eventually took over. Jordan Love was drafted as a backup and eventually took over. And none of those guys were top 10 picks. So, again, I think for the Raiders, is it smarter to say we're going to take Garrett Nussmeier or Drew Aller and let these guys develop? I don't know. I think for the Raiders, hopefully John Spytek is as smart as everybody claims he is. Hopefully Tom Brady is as smart as he is good of a quarterback. And then hopefully Pete Carroll, maybe what he's building, he has the Raiders on the right path. We'll see what ends up happening. Let me know what you guys think. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with another video.